should have, but it's too late now. Okay, first of all, I'm really delighted to have been invited to do this. Anna asked me if I would talk about my experiences in China with particular attention to experiences with women. And I'm always delighted to talk about my experiences in China because I have been running a training program there for the last 5 years, and in fact will be there again in a week. And this has been for me just one of the most crucial learning experiences that I have ever had. So I have much to tell about these experiences over 5 years, not only visiting, but I stay in touch with the people that I'm training throughout the year on Skype. So I have an ongoing association, and I have also invited some of them here to group relations conferences. Jean met a couple of the people. Jean, who's part of this group now, was at group relations conference this year where she met 2 of my students, the people I work with there. So, I'm really delighted to have this chance to talk about this. And what I thought I might do is to just do a kind of a brief survey of what I've been doing, and especially that this is a small group, then open it for whatever reactions or questions or whatever you'd like me to talk about, because there's many things that I can talk about. But I think that what I have to tell is probably somewhat different from at least some of your interest and maybe what you've heard before, because my experiences with Chinese women is not really a story about disempowerment. If anything, it's a story about empowerment of women. But it may have to do with the particular sector of Chinese society that I'm working with. And one of the things that I think is really important when I talk about China is to say that China is a country of 1.4 billion people, which is 5 times the size of the U.S. And it's almost unimaginable to try to get your mind around a society that is this large, because there are so many segments and so many sectors and subgroups and interest groups and differentials in terms of the ways of living that I think most people have in their mind when they think about China, either a picture of rural poverty, which certainly does exist, or the political structure, which is complex and very difficult for a Western mind to understand. So what I'm going to be talking about are my experiences with a very particular segment of Chinese society, which is largely the mental health community, because it was the mental health community and a group called the China Institute of Psychology, which invited me and a colleague about 6 years ago to set up a training program for Chinese psychologists in group psychotherapy. And so that's what the 2 of us have been doing. And the people that we're working with are people who are largely based in Beijing, but also people are coming now from all around the country, psychologists, and some psychiatrists coming from all over the country to participate in this training program. So those are the people that I've gotten to know. And because I am working in a therapy training capacity, I've gotten to know them quite deeply, because I run groups with them and they talk about their families, their traumas, their inner feelings, and we work with what it means to bring psychotherapy to China, because it's quite new there, and people are really just developing their ideas about how to work therapeutically. So that's a kind of a larger framework that I'm not talking about all of China, and if anybody that you ever hear purports to talk about all of China, don't trust them, because there's no way to get your mind around all of China. It's too big. So I'm talking about this little sector. And in order to do that, I feel that I need to introduce you a bit to something of the history and to something of what it looks like. Because I don't know what pictures you have in mind about China. So the important things to understand, I think, is that modern China really dates from Mao's revolution in 1949, which was the overthrow of the old traditional structures and an effort to give power back to the people, and particularly to do something about the peasantry and to raise the economic and political involvement of all of these, at that point, millions hundreds of millions of people. I don't know what the population was in 1949, and of course Mao killed a lot of them. So it was smaller, but it was still vast and gigantic. So after that revolution, he and the Communist Party really did transform Chinese society in ways that are still affecting the current population. So just to give you some dates, in 49 was the revolution, and 1958 was the Great Leap Forward, which involved trying to industrialize a largely rural society with enormous costs to the population. This was the period of time that 30 million people starved to death because he was trying to industrialize, and he didn't care about all of the people who died. And then there was the Cultural Revolution in 1966, which was just 8 years later, in which he went even further in terms of trying to homogenize Chinese society, and particularly get rid of all the intellectuals and anybody who might have any ideas that challenged his own, because he had a vision of how to create a new Chinese society, which went largely unopposed. And if it was opposed, then the people were dispersed with. And within that came an effort to address the enormous size of the Chinese population. And so what was instituted was a policy of one child only per family, particularly in the urban areas, but also in the rural areas. There were some exceptions in rural areas, but it did affect the urban population absolutely. So that people were fined hugely and punished in a lot of ways if they did try to have more than one child. So it was the one-child policy which did transform the population, as well as the Cultural Revolution and the trauma that created. But in terms of what is true in gender terms now, the one-child policy is perhaps the most immediate and direct in terms of how Chinese families are organized and how particularly younger Chinese women and men think about their future and their families. And just to fill in more recent history, the protest in Tiananmen Square was in 1989, and that's something that's very well known in the West, and that too created a lot of repercussions and trauma. But as you see in 1991, during the time of Deng Xiaoping, there was an opening to the West, and I put this on the outline of history because in 1991 the first McDonald's opened in Beijing, which was really a sign of their opening to the West. Since then, Chinese culture, if you can think about it as culture, has been enormously oriented to an extreme capitalist mentality. And in the time that I've been there, I have yet to discover what is communist about China, because it is the most capitalistic place I have ever been. Everybody is oriented to their economic well-being and how to get ahead economically. And that is the primary thing that at least people in the urban centers are thinking about, but also I understand largely in the rural areas, they are thinking about how to get their children into the urban centers so that they can make money and then lift up the family that's back in the rural part of the country. So what's mainly on people's minds, in my experience, is money and relationships. They're not very interested in politics, or international politics, or even the politics of their own country. They're interested in their own local politics, that is, politics of the workplace, the politics of getting ahead, getting into the right universities, moving from the right universities into the right jobs. If you're rich enough, going and getting educated in the West, because that gives you a lot of status. And the families are very oriented to developing in their children the ambition to do these things. And this is partly because there is no social safety net. There are no retirement plans. There's no social security. So if you are going to be cared for in your old age, it's because your child has the money to take care of you. And that has enormous effects on family structure, which are very much about raising your child so that you will have this insurance policy for your old age, and the children being just predominantly aware of their obligation to care for their aging parents. That is the first thing that every Chinese person has to do, which is to take care of their parents. So it's a very different social structure from the one that we're used to, except the sort of capitalist mentality. But the capitalist mentality is woven into this social structure, which has to do with caring for the aging generation. Now, the way that this works in terms of family structure is that the retirement age is generally pretty early in China. Most people have to retire by 50 or 55, which is just around the time that their child would be looking to have children. So the women and men, because there's not a lot of differentiation, there's a little bit, but not a lot. The parenting generation relies on their parents largely to do the child care for their child. So that when you think of Chinese families, you really have to think about them in three generational terms. So most of my students, for example, who are in their 30s or 40s, may have a child, but that child is being cared for and managed by their parents. Now, the other side of this, which is becoming now problematic in Chinese society, is that because the children's obligation is to take care of the aging parents, where you have two only children, they then have to care for four parents. And if they were to have just one child, then that child would have to care for two aging parents plus four aging grandparents. No, I'm sorry, 8 aging grandparents when they marry. So there has been recently some relaxation in the one-child policy such that two only children can now have 2 children to help care for this older generation. So this is very much on people's minds. Now I just want to show you a little bit about what Beijing looks like. Again, I've told you a little bit about social structure, but I have some photos because I want to dispel the idea of, you know, the rural, shabby place. So these are random photos taken. I think this was taken from one of my hotel rooms. And what you can see is all the tall buildings, which are primarily apartment houses and office buildings. Here's a recent office building next to other office buildings. Here is a picture of the what was the Olympic Stadium, and behind it this massive 5-star hotel, apartments and businesses, and this is an office building here. This is the CCV Tower, which is the new TV station building, and more office buildings. So you can see that this is a very modern, thriving city that sometimes makes me feel like a rube. It's much more impressive than New York City. And there's this brand new subway, and if I go back to New York and get on the subway, I think, which is the third world country, you know, I mean, there's just no question that China is no longer a third world country. It is very much part of the first world in terms of its economy and the way it looks. This is just another more random picture of a side street. This is the woman who runs the China Institute, who I work with. As you can see, modern cars, late model cars. She just got rid of her old car because it was 3 years old. I drive a car that's 11 years old. It's a modern place. The Chinese love ceremonies, so this was one of the times I was there, and they had someone bake me a cake. They don't really have cakes in China, but they're very sensitive to what foreigners want, and so they had someone bake me a cake, and they wrote on it, "Happy Birthday." They didn't really know these people don't speak English, so they didn't really know what it meant, but it seemed like a good thing to do for a Westerner, and you see how happy people are. This is some of the group of women that I work with. Most of my colleagues and students there are women. We're in a very nice restaurant here. This is the way one eats. You eat around a table, and the food is in the middle, and everybody has a little plate, and you take things as it goes around. So you never order things, you know, that you might want. This is a ceremony for some people getting the certificates of the program. Just want you to get a sense of what these women look like. This is a woman who's graduated from the program. She also is an interpreter sometimes. They still love banquets and ceremonies, and I wanted to show you this because this was a banquet that they had for me, and they insisted that I sit in this big golden chair because that's what you do. This is another banquet, and this is the woman who started this program that I'm teaching in. So I want to say something about this program and these people and the way in which I think that Chinese women are quite empowered. It may be that they are in a kind of a, I don't know, post-feminist society, if you could even think about employing that label when feminism was never really an issue. I think that what happened is that Mao really got rid of gender distinctions when everybody was a comrade and everybody had to go serve and do hard labor and go out to the countryside and work with the peasantry and take whatever jobs they had. There was really no distinction between genders in those days. So it was 180 degrees from the beginning of the 20th century when women still were binding their feet in order to be attractive to men. At this point, there was not only no longer foot binding, but there was complete gender blindness in some ways in terms of what jobs women could do. Like in every other society in the world, it tends to be women who are attracted to the nurturing professions, I guess you would call them. So it's not a surprise to me that most of the people who want to participate in this training program are women. The woman who you see here, whose name is Dr. Bai, is a woman who runs a large psychiatric clinic in Beijing, and she single-handedly made it possible for this training program to occur because she had read some of the works of Irvin Yalom and took it into her head to get him there to teach them. And she was able to contact a very entrepreneurial and wealthy friend of hers with whom she had been sent to the countryside when they were both pulled out of medical school back in the 70s and sent off to go work with the peasants. And they've stayed in touch over these years as friends, and she was able to get him to put up some of the capital to create this training program. And she brought her staff, which are primarily women who work in her clinic, to do the early training, and then got it to spread around China. She, as I say, she has a similar kind of trauma background as other people in terms of being enormously displaced during the Cultural Revolution and having to really scramble to get an education later because the universities were closed and nobody was able to get higher education. She was able to manage that. And from what I can gather from the women that I work with, there is very little sense that women are not able to do whatever they want to do as men can. So I don't know whether this is a legacy of this sort of Maoist period where women did whatever men did, but the kinds of sexist issues which I encounter in other countries in which I work simply don't seem to be present in the Chinese women that I work with. That doesn't mean that they're not in other women and in other places. But these are women who feel very much capable and believe that if they work hard, they will be able to do the things that they want to do, and indeed they are doing them. Now, when I look at the political structure of the country, that seems to be primarily dominated by men. I don't know how Chinese women think about that, whether they want more access to political power. If so, they don't say so. At least these people don't. They are more interested in trying to figure out how to provide good psychotherapy to the many people in the population who need it, to overcome the prejudices against psychotherapy, which existed in the United States in the early part of the 20th century, but were largely resolved. China, in terms of mental health, is kind of about where we were in the United States in about 1920, with trying to get over the idea that only the very ill need psychotherapy. Psychotherapy can be helpful to people who are struggling with life crises. It's a very radical idea to express your feelings openly, which is certainly a value that we bring in the training program, and people do find that doing so is useful and helpful to them, but it goes against their training, which is about concealing your feelings. Let me just put out a few more ideas, and then I'll just open this. The other thing I put on these slides is just to tell you something about the patients. Actually, I don't know how comfortable I am having this. Well, nobody's going to recognize these people, I don't think. It's in English. This is just some of the kinds of things. A lot of people ask me, well, what kind of problems do the patients bring? Are they things that are familiar in the West? And I think if you look at it, I'm not going to read it to you. It's not, the language is, I just put up on the slide what I was given, but as you can see, it's not terribly different from the kinds of issues that we encounter here in the United States. Somebody who's stressed about relationships, about work, how to deal with her anxiety and her depression. Did you read this one? Should I move on to the next? She picks the wrong man. She has a good relationship with her parents, but she's struggling with mental health issues. Here's an older woman who was having anxiety, depression, some obsessive symptoms. Like a lot of people, she somatizes a lot of her feelings, although she's experiencing some of them more emotionally rather than just physically, as many people do. She's gone into therapy to try to resolve something about her relationships and her relationships to her feelings. Well, these are the kinds of patients that people tend to bring. Here's a depressed 34-year-old woman who has a business. She has 2 children. I don't know how she managed to do that. They say there are exceptions and there are people who get by with this, but I don't know that part of her story. She's like many people in a marriage that is largely arranged. Marriages are still often arranged in China, or if they're not arranged as they are in India, where the bride meets the groom on the wedding day, they're often strongly pressured into marrying a particular man that the family has chosen, largely on the basis of his having a particular level of income. Because, again, that's important both for the well-being of the child, but also the well-being of the parents. Because if the daughter marries a man who's going to make a good living, then they have a better chance of having a good old age. I think there's one more here, another depressed woman having a hard time just generally getting on in life, had a bad conflict with her father, took out a knife to him, and that led her to be sent to the psychiatric clinic. So the problems themselves are not terribly different from what we know, but they aren't particularly gendered. That is, one could find men with very similar kinds of difficulties. The one thing that I have picked up from the women that does seem to be gendered is that there is a lot of dissatisfaction with the men who are available to them. The women feel stronger in many ways than the men. And because I like it. They feel stronger than the men. The men are a disappointment to them, especially women in mental health who are beginning to discover their own inner worlds and their feelings, complain that the men aren't sensitive, aren't interested in their feelings, they don't have good communication, they can't discuss problems. it sounds very familiar in a lot of ways, but this is the kind of dissatisfaction that many women have. Divorce is pretty available, and there are many women who just get fed up with husbands that are disappointing to them and just divorce them. If you divorce and then you remarry, the one-child policy still holds, but if you then marry a man who has not yet had a child, then you can have another child. So that's a dynamic that the one-child policy affects. Another big problem about the one-child policy, which we could think about, because I think this is going to be a very big issue in the future. It's already starting, but people are not really, at least the people that I talk to, are not really addressing it, which is that because it is widely available to select the gender of you only have one child, and you can select that gender just by finding out if your fetus is male or female. And if it's a female and you want a boy, then you just go have an abortion and try again. And that's routine. Anybody can do that. There's no stigma to it. So that more than 60% of the new births in China now are boys. And I think what people are only just starting to become dimly aware of is what is that then going to do to the dynamics later, because there's not going to be enough women for the men to marry and reproduce with. And it's already starting to come in some ways, in terms of the pressure that the men feel under to be extraordinarily successful in order to get a woman. So what the men are saying is that unless they are in a very promising career, they just have no hopes of getting a woman to go out with them. So the women are the ones who are, the ones who are buying in a situation of lots of supply, and that's affecting the dynamics. How that's going to play out in the long run, I don't know. I think they're in for a lot of trouble once the real imbalance, this huge imbalance, really hits. So that's a kind of a rundown, and I've spent the time that I kind of allotted to give you some sense of what I've been doing, and then to invite you to react or to tell me what you think about this, or what you would like to talk about from here.
Thank you, Ruthellen. People are all on mute, and so I'd like to remind you that before you try to start speaking so that we can hear you, please take yourself off mute. Or, yeah, I saw that Jeannie just did that, so that's great. You all know how to do that. If you have any difficulty, you can raise your hand or send me a message on chat, and I'll see if I can be of some assistance. Who would like to ask a question or make a comment first? Well, I'm going to. I'm going to just jump in because I have a lot of thoughts about this. First of all, Ruthellen, I want to just say that as the mother myself of two Chinese daughters who are both adopted from China, I don't know whether this is a good thing or a bad thing, but I'm actually delighted to hear about women's empowerment there, because often, because of the circumstances of their adoption, the stories that they hear about women in China stress the lack of desirability of women in China, and therefore it's sort of a compounded negative response to their country of origin. So I want to just tell you that it pleases me to think about sharing stories with them about the strength of women, not just the sort of victimization of women. So,
well, the lack of desirability is for women babies.
Right.
But if you manage to survive and get born, then you've got some pretty good chances.
Right, exactly. Catherine, you have your hand up. Please, go ahead.
Hi, yes, I agree with everything that Anna just said about you know, having a very interesting, different perspective and different story to come out of China. And since my daughter's interested in becoming a psychologist, this is definitely something that I intend to discuss with her. I was curious, you said that most of your students were female, but I'm wondering if you have a sense of the female versus male in the population of psychologists in general in the country.
I think it's probably pretty much like here. I don't know what the exact percentages are, but psychology is now female dominated in the U.S.
Mm-hmm.
And it seems to be similarly so in China. There are certainly men. I always have a group of men in my training program, but there may be 20%, 25%, something like that.
Mm-hmm.
And there's still not that much money to be made. It's about money there, as
Right.
it is to some extent here. And the helping professions have never been the way to make a lot of money. So it's not as attractive to men because they are under so much pressure to succeed economically. And the ones who are in it, sometimes they're men who have had business careers and then they switch careers because they want to do something more meaningful. It may be that as psychotherapy spreads, there will be more men who are attracted to it. It's a different history there than here because, here it came out of psychiatry, and originally psychiatry was male-dominated because they were medical people. But now, as psychology has taken over more of the psychotherapy, it is primarily female.
Mm-hmm.
So,
thank you.
Another question.
Ms. Ellen, it's Jeannie. I thank you so much for this. This was so exciting and so encouraging after watching Half the Size last night. I am curious about, I realize that there's a great cultural difference here in that women in the United States were paid less than men originally based on the value of women taking care of the home and men being the breadwinners. But I'm curious if you had any sense of the men who went into mental health making more than the women, or if you were even able to determine that, or.
Well, in mental health, there aren't that many full-time salary jobs. So most of the people who are working in mental health are sort of cobbling together, working in this clinic and that counseling center and trying to do a private practice and sort of putting together in an entrepreneurial way all these different pieces. It's not a tracked profession yet where you go to a place and you get a salary. And so there doesn't seem to be, or at least nobody has ever talked to me about feeling that they were paid less because they were women, or that there is a salary discrepancy. Although there are some cases where there are women who have a husband who's a really big wage earner, who then feel more freedom about organizing their time so as not to have to work as much. And then they may do some more childcare during that time. It's that the men are going into and getting drawn to the really high-paying professions. It's not terribly different from here, really, when you think about it. They're the ones who do high tech, who go into the corporate jobs, who network into the industrial positions where you tend to get a lot of money. And either women are not interested in those things, or they have a harder time networking into them, because everything in China is about what they call guanxi. It's about relationship. It's about connections. There's not the equalitarianism that we have here, where you have all these applicants for a job and you try to increase diversity and you try to be blind to all these things so that everybody has a chance. This is not part of the Chinese mentality. So that if you have a cousin who's in an important position and he can get you a job, well, that's how you get the job.
Mm.
It's a whole, it's just a completely different social and political structure. And when I spoke about my learning there, it seems that every time I have an interaction with them, some fundamental assumption that I have about life and the world gets blown out of the water. Because my assumptions are just always at odds with their assumptions, and you don't know them until you run into them. You know, that's how you really that's what I've learned about how I discover another culture, which is that I just bump into something that surprises me. I mean, one of the things that I learned, for example, is never to really admire something that I see or am, or am offered. Because if I say, oh, that's really wonderful, I really love the sweater that you're wearing, or I really love this tea, or something like that, they then will produce it for me the next day. And so that's been something that I've had to learn. As a guest, be careful what you admire, because you're going to get it. And it doesn't matter, the expense, whatever it is, they have to produce it for you. So that's one kind of cultural assumption, is about giving to others and what you give. Another one that I have that sort of fits this discussion is that people have a job. Most people there don't have a job. They have several jobs. So even that notion that you just, pursue a job, people, and they work very, very, very hard. They'll work 18 hours a day. That's not unusual. They'll stay up all night if there's something that has to be done, because they have this awareness that if they don't do their job perfectly, there's 6 people standing behind them who are ready to take their place. That's how competitive it is. It's also a very young society, so that I stand out because I'm Western and, I look very strange there. But also I look strange because I'm somebody over 50 on the streets. You just don't see people over 50 on the streets. It's a young society. And I don't know where the 50-year-olds are. You can sometimes see them doing Tai Chi in the parks in the morning. But, we think of 50 as pretty young. And, there, you're not. And the energy is a youthful energy, and they've got to do it fast. So there's all these kinds of assumptions which just really, really shift, as this is a group of people who are trying to make it economically, and the gender issues seem to pale next to the necessity of partnering with someone and raising a family that will be economically successful and viable and will be able to take care of the parents.
If I could just ask you one other thing, all these things that you're mentioning that you are noticing as you bump into the ways that our culture is different from their culture, have you found that all this experience causes you to problem solve differently or to think differently when you're here?
Well, I think it's broadened me enormously in terms of just seeing my own culture and my own world in context. That it's one way of doing things. It's not the way of doing things. And I couldn't really, I don't think I could have come to quite that understanding without sort of living in this other culture that does things in a very different way. And that's what's been so incredibly powerful for me, is trying to, and because I work so deeply with them, really having to enter their assumptions about the world rather than imposing my own. And that's, I think it's opened my mind in ways that are pervasive. I feel very changed as a result of this experience.
In the remaining time, I wonder if we have any other questions or comments from others.
Hi.
Catherine?
Hi, Catherine. Hi, Catherine.
Oh, hi. I'm sorry. I did have one other question, and I asked this with the not trying to sort of stereotype generations because that's impossible to do, but is your sense of the women who are involved in the mental health field, is there a difference in perspective or approach or vision, kind of in general terms, between the older generation who lived through the Cultural Revolution and the Mao era versus the younger generation who sort of are living with the legacy but not the direct impact of re-education in the in the rural areas, et cetera, et cetera?
Well, I think the thing that I've learned a lot about in the last couple of years, again, working deeply with these people, is that it dawned on me in the middle of a group that I was doing a couple of years ago where people were talking about the traumas of their early lives. And these were largely people in their 30s and maybe early 40s, but primarily 30s. I don't think it went down lower and certainly didn't go up higher than that. And they were just these unbelievably painful stories of growing up with these fairly brutal parents who beat them. It's very common to beat your child in China. That's how you teach them right from wrong. But they were pretty brutally beaten and worse. And lack of love or acceptance. I mean, it was very, very painful group. And I began to realize that sitting with them felt to me very much like sitting with a group of second-generation Holocaust survivors, that is, children of parents who had been, in the Holocaust. Mm-hmm. And I began to see that there were really a lot of similarities, that although this generation had not been directly traumatized by the Cultural Revolution, their parents were. Mm-hmm. So the parents carried that trauma into their families in terms of how they raised these children. And these children had this same sense that has been talked a lot about in second-generation Holocaust literature, about this sort of nameless dread and fear and pain, because nobody there will talk about what happened to them during this traumatic time, but they're enacting it all the time. So the children feel it and they don't know where it's coming from. And it gets internalized in complex ways. And they then feel in danger of expressing that with their own children. Mm-hmm. So the generational issues are profound, but it's the dynamics of the succession of trauma and how that gets managed. And I'm as I get to know these people better, particularly the people that I work with in an ongoing way, I start to see how almost everybody has a traumatized past in a personal way. I'm not talking collective. I mean, it is collective, but it's taken in individually in terms of their own experiences with their own parents, and then what happens when they try to form an intimate relationship, and what happens when the women try to mother, and how they think about mothering. And that's one of the things I think that I'm having some impact on, is helping some of these women become more nurturing mothers and being less afraid to express a kind of loving side of themselves, because that seemed weak. You don't, you're not nice to your children. It's not part of the script. You are demanding, and you tell them what to do, and if they don't do it, you beat them. And this is otherwise very loving, sweet, nurturing women. One of my students who I just adore, she's in her early 40s, and she's so smart and so perceptive and so warm and so loving and so in touch with her feelings. I really adore this woman. She's really great. And we were having this conversation about our daughters. She had a 13-year-old daughter. And we were having this conversation about our daughters, and she said something about her daughter wanting to do something that she didn't want her to do. So I said, how do you handle that? What do you do? She says, well, I beat her. I said, you mean you beat her like you hit her? This is all in translation, of course. you hit her? I thought maybe I wasn't understanding or the translation wasn't right. She said, of course I hit her. And you hit her hard and long? Yes, of course. I just couldn't picture this woman doing that. And then she said to me, well, didn't you beat your daughter? And I said, no. No, I didn't. And that was as incomprehensible to her as her story was to me. I think, well, maybe we have some work to do here to think about what leads to what. And then is this just a Western assumption that I'm bringing in? Then you get into all of that with when I run into these kind of tangles. It's who am I to tell them how to raise their children? Because I come from the West where we don't beat our children. They're beating their children. The children seem to be, thriving in some ways, although they're suffering in others. But our children are also suffering in ways, I don't know. So it becomes open for discussion. I don't know if that's a direct answer to your question, but sure. There are generational differences, but it's not a divide because the trauma of one generation gets passed into the next, just in different ways.
Ruthellen, this is Anna. I think that last comment, that last series of questions is particularly intriguing to me. The connection between the Holocaust survivors and these victims of trauma. I'm wondering, you have a good deal of international experience. You've not only worked in China, but also in Israel and in other countries. And I'm wondering, and then of course there are the cultural differences within groups in the United States, since we're not monolithic either.
Yeah.
So I'm trying to figure out if in fact, I don't know how to ask this question, if in fact the dominant perception, even in the United States, whatever that is today, whatever was the dominant group, is actually the aberrant group. You know what I mean? In the sense of what we see as the norm, what is written about as the norm, even in this country, is internationally, and maybe even in this country, but internationally, the outlier. I don't know how that compares to your other experiences.
I think it's an excellent question. It really raises the question now if we take a longer, wider view of how do we assess the status of women in a culture? How do we even think about that? Because what group do we look at? And then, as you say, there is just such enormous variation. And I didn't see the program that Jean saw last night, but I'm sure that if you would go to the rural areas, you would see something very, very different. So in terms of just my personal experience, although I read a great deal about these cultures, my personal experience is that I can only know well from my own experience, the people that I run into and the stories that they tell me about themselves and the people in their lives, to sort of get an impression of what is life like for, if we say here now, women in this particular stratum of society at this time. And then to try to compare that across cultures. I worked last year in India doing group relations work and got to know, I guess, a similar sector of Indian society and working with those women, and they were in a very different place from the Chinese, for example, because they were like women who were trying to get into the business world in the 60s here, including struggling with being in a role of vice president, and what do you do when the boss asks you to make coffee? That's where they were. They were like right out of Mad Men or something like that. So and the Chinese wouldn't. They wouldn't talk about stuff like that. They would. Everybody would be making the coffee. They wouldn't, or if the women are making the coffee, they wouldn't see that in gendered terms. They don't make coffee anyway, but everybody serves tea. So it could really see a cultural difference there. Israeli women, they have a different kind of issue because they're trying to break into, again, much like the U.S., into male bastions of politics and the military. But they're empowered in all the other ways. They've been university presidents, and they have seats in the Knesset, but not enough. And so they're kind of a reflection of where we are in terms of gender equality. So the larger social structure is what affects what women can do and who had what hold on power to start with. And as I say, I do have questions about why you don't see more female faces in the Politburo, for example, or whatever the Chinese Communist Party is when you see all them. And why are there no women who seem to be in the higher up positions? But there's also certain questions, you see, that I've learned they aren't going to talk to me about.
Right.
So there's a lot that's off limits. And I've also learned that there's things that it's not polite to ask. So I can't tell sometimes when I ask a question, and again, it's all in translation, so they seem not to understand it. And my interpreter is fabulous, so I think that she's putting things out that I say. But, you know, they dodge these things, or there's a lot of things they just don't think about because they're not schooled to think about how to arrange the political structure. That's just a given. It's done. And they're not empowered in the sense that, like, we're all excited about the debate tonight because everybody's going to vote. In their view, democracy is just impossible. It's not something that they think could ever work in China. It's out of the question for them. So they don't see it as the citizenry should make political decisions. We just hope that the leaders are making good decisions.
Ruthellen, I hope that you are writing and will write about all these observations because I think they're important and they're fascinating, and I think that you bring a sensitivity to them that readers would like to hear about. So.
Well, thank you. Thank you for this opportunity to talk about all this. I hope I haven't been too scattered.
No, it's been wonderful. I want to respect people's time, so I want to thank everyone for their participation in today's seminar. Most especially, of course, Ruthellen for sharing her experience, her pictures, her thoughts. I feel quite privileged that we've had this opportunity, so I thank her. I invite all of you to please join us again next Wednesday when we'll hear from Amina Doherty of the Young Feminist Fund, talk about their project called Frida, F-R-I-D-A. So with that, I will close today's webinar and wish you all well. Thank you all.
Thank you very much.
Thanks very much. This is great. Thanks, Ruthellen, and thanks, Anna.
Thank you.
Pleasure.
Bye, everybody.